Good morning, beloved. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Wherever you are right now, in your car, in your kitchen, on your way to work, or still lying in bed, I want you to pause for a moment and receive this word, because today is not an ordinary day. Today, heaven has scheduled a divine appointment with your soul. Some of you have been carrying weight that words could never fully explain. You've smiled through storms. You've shown up for everyone else while quietly falling apart on the inside. You've prayed for strength while secretly wondering if you had any strength left to give. But hear me clearly this morning. God did not bring you this far to leave you broken. He did not walk you through the fire to abandon you in the ashes. Today, we are not just praying, we are declaring restoration over every fractured place in your heart. We are calling emotional strength back into your spirit. We are commanding inner healing to rise up in every wounded, weary, and worn down part of your being. This is not a moment for silence. This is a moment for declaration, because your words carry creative power, and today we speak life. So open your mouth, lift your hands if you're able, and let's enter into this healing prayer for emotional strength and inner restoration together, because this is the day your healing begins, beloved. Before there can be healing, there must first be honesty. There is something sacred, something almost holy about the moment a person stops pretending. So many of us have spent years perfecting the art of appearing whole while quietly disintegrating on the inside. We have learned to smile in rooms full of people while our spirit is crying out for rescue. We have learned to say, "I'm" so many times that we almost believe it ourselves, even as our hearts continue to bleed in silence. But today, in this sacred space, I am inviting you to lay down the performance. I am inviting you to stop managing your image long enough to be honest with the one who already sees everything anyway. Naming the wound is not weakness. Naming the wound is not failure. Naming the wound is the first act of courage on the road to restoration, because you cannot be healed of what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot receive deliverance for a battle you are still pretending you are not fighting. There is a reason the word tells us to confess our faults one to another, to bring things into the light, because darkness thrives in silence and shame multiplies in secrecy. Whatever you have buried, whatever you have stuffed down into the basement of your soul and covered over with busyness, with religious activity, with distraction, with substances, with relationships, with achievement, that thing is still alive. It did not die simply because you stopped looking at it. It has been growing roots in the dark, and today we are bringing it into the light. Think about the wounds you carry. Some of you are carrying rejection that started in childhood, a father who was never present, a mother whose love felt conditional, a family system that taught you that you had to earn belonging. Some of you are carrying betrayal, a friend who abandoned you when you needed them most, a spouse who broke a covenant, a business partner who took what was never theirs to take. Some of you are carrying grief that you have never fully processed, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a dream, the loss of a version of your life that you thought you would have by now. Some of you are carrying shame from choices you made, decisions you cannot take back, seasons of your life you wish you could erase from the record. And some of you are carrying trauma so deep that you have never spoken it out loud to another human being, not even to yourself in the quiet of your own room. Hear me. God is not asking you to perform for him. He is not asking you to clean yourself up before you come to him. He is asking you to come as you are, wounds exposed, heart open, and say, here it is. Here is what I have been carrying. Here is what I have been afraid to look at. Because the moment you name it, you take away its power to operate in the shadows. There is something about speech, something about putting language to pain that begins to loosen its grip. This is why testimony is so powerful. This is why confession is so powerful. This is why sitting across from a trusted friend, a counselor, a pastor, and finally saying the thing you have never said changes something in the atmosphere of your soul. Many of us have misunderstood strength. We have been taught, whether by our families, our culture, or even our churches, that strength means never showing pain, never admitting struggle, never appearing anything less than victorious. We have turned spiritual maturity into an emotional performance, where the goal is to look like we have it all together rather than to actually walk the road toward wholeness. But real strength, the kind that Scripture actually models for us, looks very different. David wept. David groaned. David said his bones felt like they were wasting away because of his silence about his sin. Job sat in ashes and cried out in raw, unfiltered anguish. Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane said his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, and he asked his closest friends to stay with him in that pain. If the Son of God did not perform strength by hiding his anguish, why do we think we have to? Naming the wound requires us to slow down long enough to actually feel what we have been avoiding. So much of our lives are structured around avoidance. We fill our schedules so we do not have to sit in silence with our own thoughts. We reach for our phones the moment discomfort arises. We stay busy, we stay distracted, we stay entertained, because stillness would force us to confront what we have been running from. But healing does not happen in motion. Healing happens in stillness, in honesty, in the sacred pause where you finally stop long enough to ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? What is this heaviness? Where did this begin? I want you to understand something about wounds that go unnamed. They do not simply disappear with time. Time does not automatically heal all wounds. It is what we do with the time that determines whether healing takes place. An unnamed wound becomes a filter through which you interpret everything else in your life. It becomes the lens of your relationships, the voice behind your insecurities, the invisible hand shaping your decisions. The person who was wounded by abandonment finds themselves pushing people away before those people can leave first. The person who is wounded by criticism finds themselves unable to receive correction without spiraling into shame. The person who was wounded by betrayal finds themselves unable to trust even those who have proven themselves faithful. Unnamed wounds do not stay contained. They leak into every area of life until we finally stop and deal with the source. This is why the process of naming is not optional if you are serious about restoration. You cannot bypass this step. You cannot pray your way around honesty. You cannot fast your way around confession. There is no shortcut to wholeness that skips the moment of truth-telling. Some of you have been asking God for breakthrough in areas where you have never actually been honest about what broke you in the first place. You have been praying for the fruit of healing without tending to the root of the wound. Today, we are going back to the root. I want to walk you through what naming the wound actually looks like in practice, because this is not simply a theological concept. It is a lived, practical discipline. Naming the wound begins with permission to feel what you feel without immediately judging yourself for feeling it. So many of us shut down our own emotions before we even allow ourselves to experience them because we were taught that certain feelings are unacceptable, unspiritual, or shameful. We tell ourselves we should not be angry, we should not be sad, we should not still be affected by something that happened years ago. But emotions are not sins, they are signals. They are the nervous system of your soul telling you that something needs attention. When you suppress the signal, you do not resolve the issue. You simply lose access to the information you need to heal. After permission comes identification. This is the process of getting specific. It is not enough to say, I have been through a lot. Healing requires precision. What exactly happened? Who was involved? What did it cost you? What did you come to believe about yourself, about others, about God as a result of that experience? Many of us carry vague, generalized pain because we have never taken the time to sit down and actually trace the wound back to its origin. I am asking you this morning to do the work of identification, to journal it if you need to speak it into a recorder if that helps you process, to sit with a trusted counselor who can help you excavate what has been buried. After identification comes articulation, actually speaking the wound out loud, whether to God in prayer, to a trusted friend, to a counselor, or even to yourself in the mirror. There is scientific research that confirms what Scripture has taught us all along, that putting language to pain changes how it is processed in the brain. When pain remains unspoken, it stays stored in the body as raw, unprocessed sensation, often manifesting as anxiety, tension, illness, and emotional reactivity. But when pain is articulated, when it moves from vague feeling into specific language, it begins to move from the amygdala, the reactive center of the brain, into the prefrontal cortex, where it can be processed, understood, and integrated. This is not simply spiritual language. This is how we were designed to function. God built into us a need for confession, for testimony, for speaking truth out loud, because he knew that silence was never meant to be our permanent dwelling place. I also want to address the shame that often accompanies naming a wound, because for many of you, the resistance you feel to this process is not resistance to healing itself. It is resistance to being seen. Shame tells us that if people knew the truth about what happened to us or what we did, they would reject us, judge us, abandon us. Shame keeps us isolated because isolation feels safer than exposure. But I want you to hear this clearly. Shame cannot survive in the light of grace. The enemy's greatest strategy is to keep your wound hidden, because a hidden wound is a wound that continues to fester, continues to infect, continues to control you from the shadows. But when you bring it into the light, when you name it before God and before trusted witnesses, shame loses its grip, because shame depends on secrecy to survive. Consider the woman at the well, a woman who had been through 5 marriages and was living with a man who was not her husband. A woman who came to draw water in the heat of the day specifically to avoid the judgment of the other women in her town. Jesus did not shame her. He named her reality plainly without condemnation, and in that naming, something shifted in her. She left her water jar, the very symbol of what she came to accomplish, and ran into the town she had been avoiding, testifying openly about the encounter. The naming of her wound became the doorway to her testimony, and her testimony became the doorway to an entire town encountering the Messiah. What was hidden became the very thing that brought transformation, not only to her, but to everyone around her. I want you to consider what has been hidden in you, what conversation you have been avoiding, what memory you have been suppressing, what grief you have never allowed yourself to fully feel. I want you to consider what it would mean to finally stop performing wholeness and start pursuing actual wholeness, even if that pursuit begins with an uncomfortable, vulnerable, honest confrontation with your own pain. This is not about wallowing in your wounds or building an identity around your suffering. This is about clearing the ground so that something new can actually be built. You cannot construct a house on a foundation littered with debris. The debris has to be cleared first. Naming the wound is the clearing of the ground, the removal of debris, the honest assessment of what is actually there before restoration can begin. Some of you have spent years asking God to change your circumstances when what He has actually been waiting for is for you to be honest about your condition. Circumstances can shift and shift again, but if the internal wound remains unaddressed, you will simply recreate the same patterns in new settings with new people. This is why some of you keep ending up in similar painful situations, despite changing jobs, changing relationships, changing cities. The common denominator was never fully addressed, and until it is named, it will continue to shape the trajectory of your life, whether you acknowledge it or not. I am asking you today to consider this an invitation rather than an obligation. This is not about forcing yourself into painful memories before you are ready. And it is not about performing vulnerability for the sake of appearing spiritual. This is a gentle but firm invitation to finally stop avoiding what needs your attention, to finally give language to what has remained wordless for far too long, to finally trust that the God who already knows everything about you is not waiting to condemn you, but is waiting to meet you exactly where the wound began. He has never needed you to clean yourself up first. He has never required performance as a prerequisite for presence. He simply asks for honesty, because honesty is the doorway through which healing enters. Beloved, there is a difference between carrying something and being crushed by it, and so many of us have crossed that line without even realizing when it happened. We picked up a burden years ago, a hurt, a grief, a betrayal, a disappointment, and we told ourselves we could handle it, that we were strong enough, that we would set it down eventually. But eventually never came. Instead, we kept adding to the load. Another disappointment here, another loss there, another betrayal stacked on top of the last one. And now, so many years later, we are still walking around with all of it strapped to our backs, wondering why we feel so tired, wondering why joy feels so distant, wondering why we cannot seem to move forward no matter how hard we try. Today, I want to talk to you about releasing the weight, because there is a kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. It is not physical fatigue. It is soul fatigue. The fatigue that comes from carrying what you were never designed to carry for this long. There is a scripture that has carried entire generations of believers through their darkest seasons. The invitation to cast our cares, our burdens, our anxieties onto the one who cares for us. Notice the word cast. Casting is not a gentle setting down. Casting is a deliberate, forceful release. It is the picture of a fisherman throwing a net far from himself, not gently placing it at his feet. God is not asking you to quietly manage your burdens, tucking them neatly into a corner of your life where you can pretend they are not affecting you. He is asking you to throw them, to hurl them away from yourself with intention, because burdens that are managed rather than released will always find their way back into your hands. I think about all the ways we have learned to carry weight that was never meant to be ours. Some of you are carrying the weight of other people's expectations, spending your entire life trying to become who your parents wanted you to be, who your culture told you that you should be, who your community demanded that you present as instead of who you actually are. That is an exhausting way to live, constantly performing an identity that was assigned to you rather than one that was authentically yours. Some of you are carrying the weight of other people's opinions, replaying conversations in your mind, wondering what they meant by that comment, wondering if they were disappointed in you, wondering if you measured up. Some of you are carrying the weight of past failures, mistakes you made years ago that you have never forgiven yourself for, decisions that still echo through your present, even though the moment itself has long passed. And some of you are carrying the weight of responsibility for things that were never actually yours to carry. Other people's choices, other people's healing, other people's happiness, as though it were somehow your job to manage the emotional well-being of everyone around you while your own soul withers from neglect. Releasing the weight begins with an honest inventory of what you are actually carrying, because you cannot release what you have not identified. This is why the process of naming your wounds and releasing your weight are so closely connected. You cannot let go of a burden you have not acknowledged you are holding. I want you to picture yourself standing before God with your hands full, both hands completely occupied with things you picked up along the way, things that were handed to you by other people, things you grabbed onto because you thought holding them would somehow protect you or fix something. And I want you to hear him asking you a simple question. What is in your hands, and are you ready to open them? There is something deeply human about our resistance to letting go, even of things that hurt us. We develop a strange familiarity with our pain. It becomes, in a distorted way, comfortable because we know how to carry it, we know its weight, we know its rhythms, even as it exhausts us. Releasing it means stepping into unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory, even when it promises freedom, can feel more frightening than the familiar weight we have grown accustomed to bearing. This is why some of us stay bound to grudges we know are poisoning us, stay attached to grief we know is preventing us from moving forward, stay wrapped up in shame we know was never ours to carry in the first place. The devil you know can feel safer than the freedom you have never experienced. But hear me clearly, God did not design you to be a warehouse for pain. He did not create your spirit to be a storage unit where old hurts, old grievances, and old griefs simply accumulate indefinitely. You were designed for flow, for release, for continual renewal, not for stagnant accumulation. When water stops flowing and simply sits, it becomes stagnant, breeding things that were never meant to thrive in a living system. The same is true of your soul. When pain is held rather than released, it does not simply sit there neutrally. It begins to breed bitterness, breed anxiety, breed depression, breed physical symptoms that manifest in your body because your body was never designed to hold what your spirit was supposed to release. I want to talk specifically about the weight of unforgiveness, because this is one of the heaviest weights that so many of us carry without realizing how much it is costing us. Someone hurt you, someone betrayed you, someone said something or did something that changed the trajectory of your life, and you have held on to that offense, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, believing that holding on to it somehow punishes the person who hurt you. But unforgiveness does not punish the offender. It imprisons the one who holds it. You are the one lying awake at night, replaying the offense. You are the one whose blood pressure rises every time their name is mentioned. You are the one who cannot fully enjoy new relationships because you are still guarding yourself against a wound that was inflicted by someone else entirely. Forgiveness is not about excusing what happened or pretending it did not hurt. Forgiveness is about releasing yourself from the obligation of carrying someone else's offense for the rest of your life. I also want to speak to the weight of self-condemnation, because for many of you, the heaviest burden you carry is not something someone else did to you, but something you have never forgiven yourself for doing. You made a decision. You said something you cannot take back. You hurt someone you loved. You made a mistake that had real consequences, and you have spent every day since then paying a debt that has already been paid in full through grace. Beloved, if God has forgiven you, and he has, then your continued self-punishment is not humility. It is actually a subtle form of pride, a belief that your standard for yourself should be higher than his standard of grace. Releasing the weight means finally accepting the forgiveness that has already been extended to you, rather than continuing to serve a sentence that has already been commuted. Consider the image of a woman in labor, and I use this image intentionally because it captures something essential about the process of release. Labor is not painless. Labor requires active participation. It requires pushing. It requires effort. It requires a willingness to endure temporary discomfort for the sake of what is being birthed. But labor also has a purpose and a direction. It is not pain for pain's sake. It is pain that is moving toward release, toward new life, toward the emergence of something that could not exist while still contained. Releasing the weight you carry may not be instantaneous, and it may not be entirely painless, but it has a direction. And that direction is toward freedom, toward the birth of a version of yourself that has been trapped beneath the weight you have been carrying for far too long. Practically speaking, releasing the weight requires a decision followed by a process. The decision happens in a moment. You decide today, right now, that you are no longer willing to carry what has been weighing you down. But the process unfolds over time, because old patterns of carrying weight do not disappear simply because you made a decision. You will find yourself picking the weight back up out of habit, out of familiarity, out of the simple fact that your hands and your heart have grown accustomed to holding it. When this happens, and it will happen, the answer is not to condemn yourself for picking it back up, but to simply set it down again and again and again until releasing becomes the new pattern rather than the exception. I want you to think about what it would actually feel like to walk without the weight you have been carrying. Imagine waking up without the immediate heaviness that settles over you before you have even opened your eyes. Imagine having emotional and mental capacity available for things other than managing old pain. Imagine relationships unburdened by the baggage of past betrayals projected onto new people who have done nothing to deserve your suspicion. Imagine creativity, joy, and peace occupying the space that has been monopolized by grief and resentment for years. This is not a fantasy. This is what is actually available to you when you make the decision to release rather than continue carrying. There is a reason that Scripture uses the image of a yoke when talking about burden, an invitation to take on a yoke that is easy and a burden that is light, in contrast to the heavy yoke we have been carrying on our own. A yoke is designed for partnership. It is not meant to be carried by one alone. So much of the weight you have been carrying by yourself, refusing help, refusing support, refusing to let anyone else share the load. Either because you did not trust anyone enough to let them in, or because you believed that carrying it alone was simply your responsibility. Releasing the weight also means releasing the isolation that so often accompanies heavy burdens. It means allowing trusted people into your process, allowing community to bear witness to your struggle, allowing yourself to receive support rather than insisting on carrying everything independently. I also want to name the weight of comparison, because so many of us are carrying a burden that was never even based on our actual circumstances, but on a distorted measurement of our lives against everyone else's curated presentation of theirs. We carry the weight of feeling behind, feeling inadequate, feeling like everyone else has figured out something we have not, when in reality we are comparing our unfiltered internal experience to everyone else's filtered external presentation. This weight is particularly insidious because it convinces us that release is impossible, that we simply need to work harder, achieve more, acquire more in order to finally measure up. But comparison is a burden with no finish line. There will always be someone further ahead, and chasing that horizon will exhaust you. without ever satisfying the ache that drives the chase in the first place. Releasing the weight is also about releasing control, specifically the exhausting effort of trying to control outcomes that were never within your power to control in the first place. So much anxiety comes from gripping tightly to circumstances, relationships, and outcomes that are fundamentally beyond our ability to determine. We exhaust ourselves trying to manage things that require surrender rather than control. There is a peace that becomes available the moment you release your grip on what you cannot control and redirect your energy toward what you can actually influence, your own choices, your own healing, your own posture before God. I want you to picture your hands right now, and I want you to imagine everything sitting in them, every grudge, every regret, every fear, every burden that does not belong to you, every responsibility you took on that was never yours to carry. And I want you to imagine turning your hands over, palms facing downward, and simply letting it fall. Not gripping it one more time, not catching it before it hits the ground, just letting it go, trusting that the ground beneath you, the grace beneath you, is sturdy enough to receive what you release. This is the invitation before you today, not to manage your burdens more efficiently, not to carry them more gracefully, but to actually set them down fully and finally, and to discover what your spirit feels like when it is no longer weighted down by what it was never designed to carry. Beloved, there comes a moment in every healing journey where you must stop defining yourself by what happened to you and start remembering who you were created to be before the wound ever occurred and before the label the world tried to place upon you ever stuck. So many of us have unconsciously allowed our pain to become our identity. We introduce ourselves, if not out loud, then in the quiet narration of our own minds, as the divorced one, the abandoned one, the failure, the broken one, the one who never quite recovered from what happened. We wear our wounds like a permanent name tag, and over time, we forget that the name tag was never meant to be our name. It was an event. It was a season. It was something that happened to us, not something that was meant to become the defining essence of who we are. Today, I want to speak to the part of you that has confused your history with your identity, because reclaiming your strength begins with the recognition that you are not what broke you. There is a profound difference between acknowledging your story and being enslaved by it. Acknowledging your story means you recognize what happened, you understand how it has shaped you, and you carry the wisdom gained from it forward. Being enslaved by your story means the event has become the lens through which you interpret everything about yourself, your worth, your capability, your future. Somewhere along the way, many of you stopped seeing yourselves as people who experienced something painful and started seeing yourselves as people who are fundamentally defined by that pain. This is a subtle but devastating shift because identity determines behavior. If you believe you are broken, you will live broken. If you believe you are damaged goods, you will make choices consistent with that belief, often without even realizing you are doing it. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are become self-fulfilling, not because of some mystical law of attraction, but because our beliefs about ourselves shape every decision we make, every relationship we enter, every opportunity we either pursue or avoid. I want to remind you this morning of a truth that has been buried beneath years of pain, disappointment, and the accumulated weight of other people's opinions about you. You were never created to be defined by your worst season. Before the betrayal, before the abandonment, before the failure, before the diagnosis, before the divorce, before whatever it is that has become the chapter you keep returning to as though it were the entire book. You were fearfully and wonderfully made, formed with intention, given gifts and capacities and a purpose that predates every wound you have accumulated along the way. The wound is real. The pain is real. But the wound is not the whole story, and it was never meant to become the title of the book. Consider how Scripture handles the identity of broken people. Consider Peter, a man who denied Jesus 3 times in a moment of fear and cowardice, a betrayal so significant that it should have permanently defined him as untrustworthy, unreliable, disqualified from leadership. Yet Jesus did not allow that failure to become Peter's permanent identity. On the shore after the resurrection, Jesus asked Peter 3 times if he loved him, deliberately mirroring the 3 denials, not to shame Peter, but to redeem the narrative, to replace the story of failure with a story of restoration and commissioning. Peter went on to become one of the foundational leaders of the early church, not despite his failure, but because he refused to let his failure become his final identity. He allowed grace to rewrite the narrative rather than allowing shame to author the rest of his story. Consider also the woman caught in adultery, dragged into the public square, facing condemnation and stoning, her entire identity reduced in that moment to the worst thing she had ever done. But Jesus refused to let that moment define her. He did not deny what she had done. He simply refused to let it be the final word on who she was. He told her that he did not condemn her, and he instructed her to go and sin no more, extending both mercy and a future that was not shackled to her past. Her identity was not erased, but it was expanded beyond the narrow confines of her worst moment. I want you to consider what it would mean to extend that same grace to yourself, to refuse to let your worst season, your deepest wound, your most painful betrayal, become the permanent identity from which you operate. This does not mean pretending it did not happen. It does not mean minimizing the impact it had on you. It means refusing to let it be the final authority on who you are and what you are capable of becoming. Reclaiming your strength requires you to separate what happened to you from who you are. What happened to you is information. It is not identity. You experience betrayal. You are not defined as betrayed. You experience failure. You are not defined as a failure. You experience abandonment. You are not defined as unworthy of love. These are events that occurred in your life, not immutable characteristics woven into the fabric of your being. The moment you begin to separate the event from the identity, something shifts internally. You begin to see yourself not as broken, but as someone who went through something difficult and is in the process of healing. And there is a world of difference between those two self-perceptions. I also want to address the way trauma rewires our sense of self, because this is not simply a matter of willpower or positive thinking. When we experience significant pain, especially repeated or prolonged pain, our brains and nervous systems adapt in ways designed to protect us from future harm. We develop hypervigilance. We develop protective narratives about our own unworthiness as a way of managing expectations and avoiding future disappointment. We develop patterns of self-sabotage that paradoxically feel safer than the vulnerability of hoping for something better and potentially being disappointed again. Reclaiming your strength is not simply a matter of deciding to think differently. It often requires actively retraining thought patterns that have become deeply ingrained coping mechanisms. This is holy work, and it is also often difficult, ongoing work that may require support, community, and yes, sometimes professional counseling alongside your spiritual practice. There is a particular kind of strength that emerges specifically because of what you have walked through, not despite it. I am not romanticizing trauma or suggesting that pain is somehow a gift to be grateful for, but I am acknowledging that many of you have developed a resilience, an empathy, a depth of understanding, and a capacity for compassion precisely because of what you have endured. This is not the same as saying the pain was good. It is saying that God is skilled at bringing forth strength from places of devastation, at cultivating beauty from ashes, at using even our most painful seasons as material for a strength that could not have been developed any other way. The question is not whether you will carry the marks of what happened to you. The question is whether those marks will become evidence of your defeat or evidence of your survival and eventual thriving. I want to speak directly to the lies that often attach themselves to our identity after significant pain. There is the lie that says you are damaged beyond repair, that whatever was broken in you is permanently broken, unfixable, and destined to sabotage every future relationship and opportunity. This lie keeps people from pursuing healing because it convinces them healing is impossible in the first place. There is the lie that says you deserve what happened to you, that somehow your pain is a form of justice for who you are or what you have done, a lie that keeps people trapped in cycles of self-punishment long after any actual debt has been paid. There is the lie that says your value is determined by your usefulness, your productivity, your ability to perform for others, a lie that keeps people running on an exhausting treadmill of achievement, never able to rest in the simple truth that their worth was never contingent on their output. Each of these lies attaches itself to identity, reshaping how you see yourself at the deepest level. And reclaiming your strength requires actively dismantling each one. Reclaiming strength is also about reclaiming your voice, because so many of us, after significant wounding, learn to shrink ourselves, to make ourselves smaller, quieter, less visible, as a strategy for avoiding further pain. If speaking up led to punishment before, silence starts to feel safer. If being seen led to criticism or rejection before, invisibility starts to feel like protection. But this shrinking, while it may have served a protective purpose in a specific season, was never meant to become a permanent posture. Part of reclaiming your strength is giving yourself permission to take up space again, to speak again, to be visible again, to stop apologizing for your presence and start walking in the confidence of someone who understands their inherent worth is not up for negotiation based on other people's reactions to them. I want to talk about the process of rebuilding strength, because strength is not simply reclaimed through a single declaration. It is rebuilt incrementally, much like a muscle that has atrophied through disuse must be gradually strengthened through consistent, intentional exercise. You do not walk into a gym after months of inactivity and expect to lift the same weight you once lifted effortlessly. You start small, you build consistency, and over time, capacity increases. The same is true of emotional and spiritual strength. If you have spent years operating from a place of fear, shame, or diminished self-worth, reclaiming strength will not happen through a single prayer or a single sermon, though both can be catalytic moments. It happens through the daily, consistent practice of choosing truth over the lie, choosing courage over avoidance, choosing to show up even when showing up feels vulnerable and uncertain. Part of this rebuilding process involves surrounding yourself with people and environments that reinforce truth rather than reinforcing the old narrative of brokenness. If you are constantly in spaces, whether physical, relational, or even digital, that reinforce the message that you are not enough, that your past disqualifies you, that your wounds define you, it will be exceedingly difficult to reclaim a different identity, regardless of how sincerely you desire to change your internal narrative. Reclaiming strength often requires boundaries, sometimes uncomfortable ones, with people or environments that continually reinforce the old, wounded identity rather than supporting the emerging, restored one. I also want to speak about the role of declaration in this process, because there is something powerful about actually speaking a new identity into existence, even before you fully feel it to be true. This is not about denial or toxic positivity, pretending pain does not exist or forcing an artificial cheerfulness over genuine struggle. It is about actively practicing the discipline of speaking truth over your life, even when your emotions have not yet caught up to that truth. Faith often precedes feeling. You may not feel strong today, but declaring, "I am being restored to strength," is an act of faith that begins to reshape the internal landscape over time, aligning your words with the truth of who God says you are rather than the lies that pain has whispered into your identity for far too long. Consider the way athletes visualize success before it occurs, mentally rehearsing victory as a way of preparing their minds and bodies for actual performance. There is a spiritual parallel here. When you declare truth over your identity, when you speak restoration rather than brokenness, healing rather than permanent damage, strength rather than weakness, you are engaging in a form of spiritual visualization that begins to align your internal reality with the truth God has already spoken over you. This is not magical thinking. It is a recognition that our internal narratives shape our external realities, and that we have agency in choosing which narrative we allow to take root. I want to remind you that reclaiming your strength does not mean returning to exactly who you were before the wound occurred. Healing rarely works that way. You are not being restored to a previous version of yourself as though the wound never happened. You are being formed into a new version of yourself, one that carries the wisdom of what you have walked through without being controlled by it. This new version of you may actually be stronger, wiser, more compassionate, and more resilient than the version that existed before the wound. Not because the wound was good, but because God is skilled at redemption, at taking what was meant to destroy you and using it as raw material for a strength that could not have existed any other way. I want you to sit with this truth. Your brokenness was never your identity. It was your assignment for a season. a season that God intends to use as the foundation for a testimony rather than a life sentence. The wound does not disqualify you. The failure does not disqualify you. The betrayal, the abandonment, the diagnosis, the divorce, none of it disqualifies you from walking in the fullness of who you were created to be. You are not what happened to you. You are who God says you are. And it is time to start living from that truth rather than from the shadow of what you have survived. Beloved, the mind is the battlefield where every healing journey is either won or lost, because it does not matter how much progress you make in your circumstances if the internal landscape of your thinking remains unchanged. You can change your relationships, change your environment, change your job, change your city. But if the patterns of thought that govern your inner life remain rooted in anxiety, fear, and distorted perception, you will simply recreate the same emotional experience in a new setting. This is why Scripture places such profound emphasis on the renewing of the mind, not the renewing of circumstances, not even primarily the renewing of behavior, but the renewing of the mind, because everything else flows downstream from what is happening in the thought life. Today, I want to speak directly to the mental and emotional patterns that have kept so many of you trapped in cycles of anxiety and fear. And I want to invite you into the process of renewal that leads to genuine peace and clarity. Anxiety, at its core, is often the mind's attempt to control an uncertain future by mentally rehearsing every possible negative outcome, as though sufficient worry could somehow prevent disaster or prepare us adequately for whatever might occur. But anxiety does not actually protect us from pain. It simply ensures that we experience pain twice. Once in the anticipation, and again if the feared event actually occurs, and often a third time in the countless scenarios that never even happened, but that we suffered through anyway in our minds. This is one of the cruelest tricks anxiety plays on us. It convinces us that worry is productive, that if we just think about the problem enough, we will somehow arrive at safety or certainty. But anxiety rarely produces clarity. It produces exhaustion, and it keeps the mind locked in a state of perceived threat, even when no actual threat is present in the current moment. I want you to understand something about the nature of fear and anxiety from a physiological standpoint, because this is not simply a spiritual issue. It is also a deeply embodied one. When the mind perceives threat, whether that threat is real and immediate or simply anticipated and imagined, the body responds identically, activating the same stress response, flooding the system with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing the body for fight or flight. The problem is that most of the threats many of us are responding to are not immediate physical dangers. They are anticipated future scenarios, old wounds being replayed, or catastrophic thinking about circumstances that have not yet occurred and may never occur at all. Yet the body does not know the difference between an actual threat and an imagined one. It responds the same way regardless. This means that chronic anxious thinking keeps the body in a near constant state of stress activation, which has real consequences for physical health, emotional regulation, and overall well-being. Renewing the mind is not simply about feeling more peaceful. It is about interrupting a physiological cycle that is actively taxing your entire system. Scripture gives us a specific instruction that has become almost cliche through overuse, yet remains profoundly practical when actually applied, taking every thought captive, making it obedient to truth. This is active, intentional work. It does not happen passively. Most of us have never been taught to actually examine our thoughts critically, to ask whether a particular thought is true, whether it is helpful, whether it aligns with what God has actually said about our situation, or whether it is simply an old pattern of catastrophic thinking running on autopilot. Renewing the mind requires developing what might be called metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking, to step back from a thought long enough to examine it rather than simply accepting it as an accurate representation of reality. Consider how much of your anxious thinking is actually based on evidence versus how much is based on assumption, projection, or old patterns being replayed onto new situations. Many of us developed our anxious thought patterns in response to real experiences: a parent who was unpredictable, a relationship that ended in betrayal, a season of genuine instability or danger. In that original context, hypervigilance may have actually served a protective function. It kept you alert, kept you prepared, kept you safe in an environment that genuinely warranted caution. But the mind, Once trained toward hypervigilance, often continues operating from that same defensive posture long after the original threat has passed, applying old protective patterns to new situations that do not actually warrant the same level of alarm. This is why you might find yourself catastrophizing about a new relationship based on wounds from an old one, or assuming the worst about a new job situation based on trauma from a previous workplace. The mind is doing what it learned to do to protect you, even when that protection is no longer necessary or helpful in the present context. Renewing the mind, then, involves a process of retraining, teaching your mind new patterns to replace the old ones that were shaped by past pain. This is not simply a matter of trying harder to think positively. Positive thinking without addressing the underlying patterns often functions as a temporary bandage rather than genuine transformation. Renewal requires actually engaging with the specific thoughts that generate anxiety, examining them honestly, and deliberately replacing them with thoughts that are both true and life-giving. This is precisely what Scripture means when it instructs us to think on whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is excellent or praiseworthy. This is not naive positivity. It is a deliberate redirection of mental focus away from catastrophic, fear-based thinking and toward thoughts that are actually grounded in truth and goodness. I want to address the specific lies that anxiety often tells us, because identifying these patterns is essential to dismantling them. Anxiety often tells us that we must have certainty before we can have peace, that we cannot rest until every variable is controlled and every outcome is guaranteed. But this is a lie, because certainty is rarely available to us in this life, and demanding certainty as a prerequisite for peace guarantees a life without peace, since the future remains fundamentally uncertain regardless of how much we worry about it. Anxiety also tells us that the worst case scenario is the most likely scenario, that we should prepare for catastrophe because catastrophe is probably coming. But statistically and experientially, most of what we fear never actually happens. And even when difficult things do happen, we typically discover resources, support, and resilience we did not know we had access to until the moment we actually needed them. Anxiety also often masquerades as responsibility, convincing us that worry is somehow a form of care, that if we stop worrying about a person or a situation, we are being negligent or unloving. This is a particularly insidious lie because it makes anxiety feel virtuous rather than harmful. But worry has never actually protected anyone or changed any outcome. It simply exhausts the one doing the worrying while accomplishing nothing productive in the actual situation. There is a difference between genuine care, which involves appropriate action, prayer, and presence, and anxious worry, which involves mental rumination that produces no actual benefit to anyone, including the person being worried about. Renewing the mind also requires addressing the specific cognitive distortions that fuel anxious and fearful thinking. There is all or nothing thinking, where situations are perceived in absolute extremes with no middle ground, where a single mistake means total failure, where one disappointing interaction means a relationship is doomed. There is catastrophizing, where the mind automatically jumps to the worst possible outcome without evidence to support that conclusion. There is mind reading, where we assume we know what others are thinking about us, usually assuming the worst without any actual evidence for those assumptions. There is emotional reasoning, where we assume that because we feel something is true, it must actually be true, even when our feelings are not accurately reflecting reality. Learning to identify these patterns as they occur is a crucial step in renewing the mind, because you cannot dismantle a pattern you do not recognize as it is happening. I want to talk about the practice of present moment awareness as a tool for renewing the mind, because so much anxiety is rooted in either rehearsing the past or catastrophizing about the future, while genuine peace is almost always available in the present moment itself. Scripture reminds us not to worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself, and each day has enough trouble of its own. This is not permission to be irresponsible about genuine planning and preparation. It is an instruction against the mental habit of carrying tomorrow's potential troubles into today's actual moment. When you find your mind racing toward future scenarios that have not yet occurred, or replaying past events that cannot be changed. A practical spiritual discipline is to gently but firmly redirect your attention to the present moment, to what is actually true and actually happening right now, in this breath, in this space, in this specific point in time. Renewing the mind also requires developing a practice of gratitude, not as a superficial positivity technique, but as a genuine redirection of mental focus toward what is actually good and present in your life, counterbalancing the mind's natural tendency toward threat detection and negative focus. Our brains are actually wired with what researchers call a negativity bias, a tendency to give more weight and attention to negative information than positive information, a pattern that likely served an evolutionary protective function, but that can dominate our thought life if left unchecked. Deliberately practicing gratitude, actually naming specific things you are thankful for rather than simply thinking vaguely about being grateful, helps to counterbalance this negativity bias, training the mind to notice goodness with the same automaticity with which it currently notices threat. I want to speak about the role of scripture and truth declaration in the renewal process, because there is something powerful about actively replacing anxious thoughts with specific spoken truth rather than simply trying to stop thinking anxious thoughts through sheer willpower. Trying to simply not think about something is notoriously ineffective. The mind needs somewhere to go, some alternative thought to land on, or it will default back to the anxious pattern it has practiced so many times before. This is why declaration and scripture meditation are so effective as tools for renewal. They give the mind a specific, true, life-giving alternative to land on rather than leaving a vacuum that anxiety will inevitably fill back in. I also want to acknowledge that renewing the mind is not always simply a spiritual matter. And for some of you, this process may also require professional support, therapy, or in some cases, medical intervention. Anxiety disorders are real, clinically recognized conditions that sometimes require more than prayer and declaration alone to fully address. And there is no shame in seeking professional help alongside your spiritual practice. God works through many avenues, including trained counselors, therapists, and medical professionals, and seeking their support is not evidence of insufficient faith. It is wisdom, recognizing that healing often comes through multiple channels working together rather than through a single approach in isolation. Clarity, the counterpart to peace in this renewal process, emerges as anxious. Fear-based thinking gradually gives way to grounded, truth-based thinking. When the mind is dominated by fear, decision-making becomes distorted. We make choices from a place of scarcity, from a need to control outcomes, from a desperate attempt to avoid pain rather than from a place of genuine discernment and wisdom. Clarity emerges when the nervous system settles enough for the prefrontal cortex, the rational, discerning part of the brain, to actually engage effectively, rather than being overridden by the reactive, fear-driven responses of a nervous system stuck in survival mode. This is why so many of us make our worst decisions when we are anxious. Anxiety literally impairs the brain's capacity for clear, wise thinking, prioritizing immediate threat avoidance over long-term wisdom and discernment. I want you to consider what decisions you have made recently from a place of anxiety rather than clarity. What relationships you have entered or exited based on fear rather than genuine discernment. What opportunities you have avoided or pursued based on anxious reactivity rather than grounded wisdom. Renewing the mind is not simply about feeling better emotionally, though that is certainly part of it. It is about restoring your capacity for clear, wise, grounded decision-making so the choices you make moving forward are rooted in truth and peace rather than in the reactive patterns of an anxious, wounded mind. This renewal is a daily practice, not a single event. You will not renew your mind once and be permanently free from anxious thought patterns forever. Renewal is an ongoing discipline. Much like physical exercise requires consistent practice rather than a single workout. Some days the old patterns will resurface, old fears will whisper familiar lies, and the work will be to recognize them, name them, and deliberately choose truth once again. This is not failure. This is the actual process of renewal, a continual moment-by-moment choosing of truth over fear, peace over anxiety, clarity over confusion, until these new patterns become as familiar and automatic as the old anxious patterns once were. Beloved, there is a moment in every healing journey that requires something different from everything that came before it. A moment that requires you to actually move, to actually step forward, rather than remaining indefinitely in the posture of processing, examining, and understanding your pain. Naming the wound was necessary. Releasing the weight was necessary. Reclaiming your strength and renewing your mind were necessary. But none of these steps were ever meant to be the final destination. They were preparation for movement, preparation for the actual walking out of restoration in your daily life. Today, I want to speak to those of you who have done significant internal work, who have grown in self-awareness, who have prayed and processed and grieved and declared truth over your life, but who have not yet taken the actual steps forward that restoration requires. Understanding your healing is not the same as walking in it. Insight is not the same as movement. Today, we are talking about what it looks like to actually step into wholeness and move forward with genuine confidence. Restoration is not simply a return to a previous state. It is the emergence of something new, built upon the foundation of everything you have walked through. When something is restored, whether an old piece of furniture, a historic building, or a damaged relationship, the restoration process does not erase the history of what happened to it. It honors that history while creating something functional, beautiful, and whole moving forward. This is important to understand because many of us have unconsciously believed that restoration means erasing our past, pretending the wound never happened, returning to some idealized version of ourselves that existed before the pain occurred. But that is not restoration. That is denial. True restoration integrates everything you have walked through into a whole, functioning, thriving version of yourself that carries wisdom rather than being controlled by wounds. I want to talk about the difference between healing and wholeness because these terms are often used interchangeably but actually represent different stages of the same journey. Healing is the process by which wounds are addressed, where pain is acknowledged, where the initial work of recovery takes place. Wholeness is what emerges on the other side of that healing-us process, an integrated state where the various parts of your life, your emotional health, your relationships, your purpose, your spiritual life, function together in harmony rather than existing in fragmented, disconnected pieces. Walking in restoration means moving from the healing stage into the wholeness stage, from addressing wounds to actually living an integrated, functional life that reflects the healing that has taken place internally. One of the greatest obstacles to walking in restoration is what I call identity lag. The phenomenon where your internal healing has progressed further than your external behavior and choices. This happens because old patterns of behavior were often developed as protective mechanisms during your wounded season. And even after genuine internal healing occurs, those behavioral patterns do not automatically update themselves. You may have done the internal work of releasing bitterness towards someone who hurt you, yet you still flinch and withdraw whenever they are mentioned. You may have done the internal work of reclaiming your worth, yet you still find yourself apologizing excessively. Still find yourself shrinking in rooms where you have every right to take up space. Still find yourself waiting for permission to pursue opportunities you are fully qualified to pursue. This identity lag is not evidence that your healing was not real. It is simply evidence that behavioral change often takes longer than internal cognitive change, and walking in restoration requires patiently, intentionally closing that gap between who you have become internally and how you are actually showing up externally. Closing this gap requires practicing new behaviors even before they feel completely natural. Even before your confidence has fully caught up to your healing. This is uncomfortable because it means acting from a place of restored identity, before that identity feels fully embodied, before it feels like second nature. But confidence is not primarily a feeling that precedes action. It is far more often a byproduct of action taken despite uncertainty. You do not wait to feel confident before you speak up in the meeting. You speak up, and confidence develops through the repeated practice of doing the thing that once felt impossible. You do not wait to feel completely whole before you pursue the relationship, the opportunity, the dream that has been waiting for you. You pursue it, walking in the restoration that has already begun internally, even while parts of the journey are still unfolding. I want to address the fear of relapse that often keeps people from fully stepping into restoration. The fear that if they move forward too confidently, too boldly, they are somehow tempting fate, inviting the same pain to return, or setting themselves up for a fall. This fear keeps people perpetually cautious, perpetually hedging their bets, never fully investing in their own restoration because some part of them remains braced for disappointment. But living perpetually braced for disappointment is not actually protection. It is a form of preemptive suffering, experiencing the pain of anticipated failure before failure has even occurred, and often in a way that becomes self-fulfilling because a posture of fear rarely produces confident, effective action. Walking in restoration requires releasing this fear of relapse and choosing instead to walk forward with genuine hope, understanding that even if difficulties arise again in the future, you are no longer the same person who was overwhelmed by difficulty before. You now carry tools, wisdom, and resilience that did not exist in you previously. There is a particular kind of confidence that emerges specifically from having walked through restoration, a confidence that is qualitatively different from the confidence of someone who has never faced significant adversity. This is not the fragile confidence of someone whose self-assurance depends on everything going according to plan. It is a tested, resilient confidence that has already proven it can survive difficulty and emerge intact. This kind of confidence does not require the absence of future challenges to remain stable. It has already demonstrated through lived experience that challenges can be survived, that pain can be processed, that restoration is possible even after devastating loss. This is the confidence available to you now, not because you have avoided difficulty, but precisely because you have walked through it and are still standing. I want to talk about the practical dimensions of moving forward because restoration is not simply an internal spiritual reality. It must translate into actual decisions, actual behavioral changes, actual steps taken in the real circumstances of your life. This might mean finally pursuing the career change you have been postponing out of fear. This might mean setting the boundary with a family member that you have avoided setting for years. This might mean opening yourself to a new relationship after significant heartbreak, allowing vulnerability again despite the risk involved. This might mean finally addressing a health concern you have been avoiding, or finally pursuing the education, the certification, the creative project that has been sitting dormant while you focused on internal healing work. Restoration that remains purely internal, that never translates into actual external movement, is incomplete. At some point, the internal work must give birth to external action, or the restoration remains theoretical rather than lived. I want to acknowledge that moving forward often requires grieving what will not be restored in the way you originally hoped. Sometimes restoration does not mean the relationship is repaired. Sometimes it means you find peace and wholeness independent of that relationship ever being reconciled. Sometimes restoration does not mean circumstances return to how they were before loss occurred. Sometimes it means you build a meaningful life within new circumstances that you never would have chosen for yourself. Walking in restoration sometimes requires releasing attachment to a specific outcome you had hoped restoration would produce and instead embracing the actual form that wholeness takes in your particular circumstances. Even when that form looks different from what you originally envisioned, consider the story of Job, a man who lost virtually everything, his children, his wealth, his health, his social standing, in a series of devastating losses that would break most people beyond recovery. Yet the narrative tells us that in the aftermath, Job was restored, not simply to his previous state, but with even greater abundance than before. Importantly, though, this restoration did not erase what had happened. Job carried the memory and the wisdom of his suffering even as he moved forward into renewed blessing. His restoration was not a return to naivety, to a life untouched by suffering. It was a forward movement into a new season that incorporated the wisdom gained through devastating loss. This is the pattern of true restoration, not an erasure of the past, but a forward movement that carries wisdom gained through difficulty into a genuinely new and often more meaningful season of life. I want to speak to the specific fear of being seen fully restored, because for some of you, there is an unconscious resistance to actually walking in complete restoration, a fear that relates to identity, to belonging, or to the discomfort of change itself. Some of you have built community, relationships, and even a sense of purpose around your woundedness. And the prospect of full restoration feels disorienting because it requires releasing an identity that, however painful, has become familiar and even, in some strange way, purposeful. If your identity has been built around being the wounded one, the survivor, the one who understands suffering deeply, full restoration can feel like losing something, even though what you are actually gaining is far greater than what you are releasing. Walking in restoration sometimes requires grieving the loss of an identity built around woundedness, even as you step into a healthier, more whole identity built around resilience and restored purpose. Moving forward with confidence also requires developing new patterns of relating to setbacks, because walking in restoration does not mean you will never encounter difficulty again. It means you will encounter difficulty from a fundamentally different internal posture than you did before your healing journey began. Previously, a setback might have triggered a full collapse back into old wounds, old shame, old fear-based thinking. Now, having walked through genuine restoration, a setback can be acknowledged, processed, and moved through without triggering a complete return to your previous state of brokenness. This is one of the clearest markers of genuine restoration. Not the absence of future difficulty, but a fundamentally different capacity to navigate difficulty when it arises without being permanently derailed by it. I want to talk about purpose as it relates to walking in restoration, because so often the very wounds you have walked through become the foundation for a purpose and a calling that could not have existed without that specific journey. This does not mean the pain was good or that God caused the pain in order to produce purpose. It means God is skilled at redemption, at taking what the enemy intended for destruction and using it as raw material for a calling that serves and blesses others who are walking through similar journeys. Many of you will find that your greatest ministry, your most impactful work, your deepest capacity for empathy and connection with others emerges directly from the very wounds you have walked through and been restored from. Walking in restoration then is not simply about personal recovery. It often involves stepping into a purpose that specifically utilizes the wisdom gained through your healing journey to serve and encourage others who are walking a similar road. I want you to consider what it would look like to actually walk forward today, not tomorrow, not once you feel completely ready, not once every remaining doubt has been resolved, but today, in whatever specific way restoration is inviting you to move. Perhaps it is a conversation you need to have. Perhaps it is an application you need to submit. Perhaps it is a boundary you need to communicate. Perhaps it is simply choosing to show up fully present in your relationships today rather than remaining guarded and protected as you have been for so long. Restoration is not primarily a feeling you wait to arrive. It is a series of choices you make to walk forward, trusting that confidence, clarity, and further healing will continue to develop as you move, rather than waiting for perfect readiness before you take the first step. Confidence, ultimately, is not the absence of fear or uncertainty. It is the willingness to move forward despite the presence of fear and uncertainty, trusting that you have been equipped through everything you have walked through with everything necessary to navigate whatever lies ahead. You are not walking into your future the same person who was originally wounded. You carry wisdom now. You carry resilience now. You carry a demonstrated capacity to survive difficulty and emerge, not unscathed, but whole, integrated, and equipped for what comes next. This is what it means to walk in restoration, not a return to who you were before the wound, but a forward movement into who you have become through the process of healing, carrying every lesson, every ounce of wisdom, and every restored piece of your identity into a future that you are now fully equipped to step into with genuine, tested, resilient confidence.